The wind howled that evening like a beast searching for its prey. Across the quiet farmlands of western Massachusetts, a storm was crawling in from the east, dark, heavy, and restless. Within the fading light of October 1870, a single candle flickered in the upper window of Caldwell Manor, its trembling glow fighting a battle it could never win against the darkness surrounding it. Inside, silence ruled, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill the room, it presses against the soul. And in that silence, a young girl sat perfectly still, her pale face illuminated by the candlelight, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Her name was Alara Caldwell, and that night something began, something that science, even a century later, would never be able to explain. But before we continue with this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. Timothy Caldwell was a man of science. Born in 1828, he'd studied at Harvard and later became known across New England for his precise understanding of medicine and anatomy. A man who believed that every mystery could be reasoned, examined, or dissected into truth. He had no room in his mind for superstition, no patience for folklore. Yet in the autumn of 1870, Timothy's iron logic began to rust. It started subtly. His 12-year-old daughter, Alara, began speaking in her sleep. Not uncommon for children, he thought. But it wasn't the act of sleep-talking that unnerved him. It was the words she said, in languages she could not possibly know. Greek, Latin, sometimes even dialects of Old Gaelic, which no one in Massachusetts had spoken for generations. Timothy noted everything meticulously in his journal. October 14th, 1870. Subject, Alara Caldwell. Patient entered state of agitation during nocturnal rest. Vocalized phrases in dead tongue resembling classical Latin. Tone monotone, trance-like. No fever, no known cause. He approached it as a scientist. His wife Margaret approached it as a mother, with fear. At first, she prayed quietly at night, believing perhaps that the child was being tested by heaven. But when Alara began waking up covered in cold sweat, muttering fragments of names, Margaret stopped praying for strength. She started praying for mercy. Timothy didn't believe in curses. He believed in cause and effect. But when he saw his daughter's reflection one night, her eyes wide open as she slept, her pupils black and unmoving, something broke inside him. For the first time in his life, the physician felt afraid of the body, afraid of the mind. By November, the small town of Caldwell's Ridge had begun to whisper. Children who played near the manor claimed they could hear humming, soft, lilting music coming from Alara's window, even when the house was dark. The local pastor, Father Winslow, paid an unexpected visit one afternoon, carrying with him a Bible and a subtle tone of suspicion. "Dr. Caldwell," he said, "there are things we cannot heal with herbs or scalpels." Timothy laughed at first, not mockingly, but in disbelief. "Reverend, my daughter is ill. That is all. The mind can play cruel tricks." The Reverend's eyes didn't move from Timothy's. "And if it isn't her mind, doctor? What if it's something using her mind?" That night the doctor wrote again in his journal, though his handwriting trembled. "I find myself at odds with reason. Her pulse remains steady, her temperature constant, yet she speaks, no, whispers, of places and people long gone. Tonight she uttered the name Asha Ruin. I have found no record of such a name. Winter came early that year. The snow fell thick and heavy, sealing the Caldwell estate from the rest of the town. Inside, Alara grew weaker. She refused to eat, sometimes staring at the walls for hours, her lips moving soundlessly. Margaret begged Timothy to send for a priest. "Please," she cried one night, "I don't care what you believe, just help her." But Timothy was stubborn. His faith was in knowledge. He wrote to colleagues in Boston describing the strange condition as a potential case of somnolence coupled with temporary dissociative psychosis. One replied with a chilling suggestion. "Perhaps you are not witnessing an ailment of the body, but of time itself." Timothy dismissed it, yet the idea haunted him, because the deeper he studied his daughter's condition, the more he realized she wasn't just repeating words. She was remembering something. One night, while studying by lamplight, he heard her voice again from the next room. Not her usual murmurs, but a full sentence, spoken clearly, in a tone far older than her years. "He took me by the river, and I never returned." Timothy froze. His lamp flickered. When he rushed into Ilara's room, she was sitting upright in bed, her eyes open, tears running silently down her cheeks. "Who took you?" he whispered. Her gaze shifted to him, slow and deliberate. "You should not ask questions that were never meant to be answered." Then she fell back into silence. By late December, her episodes became violent. Doors slammed, objects moved without touch. Her drawings, once childish doodles of horses and flowers, turned into detailed sketches of places no one recognized, ruins, towers and faces from another century. Timothy's once orderly notes began to read like a descent into madness. Something is speaking through her. Voices, during thunderstorms, whispering my name. Dreams of drowning. Always the river. The townsfolk had stopped visiting entirely. Only the local apothecary, an old friend named Joseph, dared approach. When he came bearing medicine, he found the doctor a shell of the man he once was. "She's not sleeping, Joseph," Timothy muttered. "It's as if she's remembering someone else's death." Joseph frowned. "You're talking nonsense, Tim." "Am I?" the doctor whispered. "Because last night she told me how you will die." The apothecary left and never returned. It was on January 3rd, 1871, the coldest night of that winter, that the unthinkable happened. At precisely 3:11 a.m., a thunderclap shook the house. Margaret woke screaming. She claimed she'd seen a woman standing at the foot of her bed, dripping wet, her eyes white as snow. Timothy rushed into Ilara's room and found her standing in the corner, her hands outstretched, whispering softly to the wall. The wallpaper began to peel, slowly, as if touched by invisible heat. And beneath it, words, ancient symbols, carved directly into the wooden frame of the house. Symbols no one had seen before. Timothy fell to his knees. "Ilara, stop! For God's sake!" She turned to him, and for the first time smiled. But it wasn't her smile. It was someone else's. "The river remembers," she said. "Even when the living forget." The lamp shattered. Darkness swallowed the room. And when light returned, Ilara was gone. The search lasted 3 days. Locals combed through the snow-covered fields, the frozen stream behind the manor, and the woods beyond the ridge. No footprints, no signs of struggle. It was as if she had never existed. On the 4th day, a child from the village came running to the Caldwell gate. He'd been playing by the riverbank, and he'd found something. A doll, Ilara's doll, waterlogged, its porcelain face cracked, and something carved into its back in jagged letters. A.R. Timothy's journal stopped after that day. But that isn't where the story ends. In 1893, when workers began restoring the old Caldwell estate, they uncovered a section of wall sealed behind the parlor. Inside was a hidden room, small, cold, untouched. On its walls were hundreds of symbols, carved by hand, and at the center of the room, etched deep into the floorboards, were the words, "She will return when the river calls her name." The foreman who discovered it swore he heard humming before he left the house that day. A child's humming, faint, distant, almost waiting. And in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, there still exists one final note written in Timothy Caldwell's trembling hand. It was not madness. It was memory. The girl was not ill. She was remembered. The winter thaw came late that year, and when it did, it came like a slow awakening. The ice along the Caldwell River broke apart in quiet sighs, and the world seemed to breathe again. But inside the once proud Caldwell Manor there was only silence, the kind that hung in the air like ash after a fire. The house was abandoned by spring. Margaret Caldwell had gone mad, they said. She spent her final days wandering the manor's upper halls, whispering her daughter's name to walls that never answered. As for Dr. Timothy Caldwell, no one truly knew. Some claimed he'd left town, heading toward Boston, carrying only a leather-bound journal. Others whispered he had followed the river one night and never returned. The story of Ilara Caldwell faded into rumor. By 1873, the townsfolk no longer spoke her name aloud, fearing it might invite something back. The manor became an empty relic, the last remnant of a tragedy no one wanted to understand. But the truth never truly disappears. It simply waits, buried beneath time, like bones beneath the frost. And in the summer of 1893, 23 years after Ilara vanished, The Caldwell estate was purchased by a man named Professor Abram Layton, an Oxford scholar fascinated by anomalous human phenomena. He was tall, severe, with a mind sharpened by obsession. His arrival in Caldwell's Ridge was met with polite curiosity until he announced his purpose. "I intend," he declared to the townspeople, "to investigate what happened here. Not as superstition, but as science." He believed Ilara's case to be an example of genetic memory, the theory that the mind could inherit memories from previous generations. It was radical for its time, dismissed by most scientists as fantasy. But Layton was not deterred by ridicule. He arrived at the manor with 2 assistants, a young physician named Dr. Samuel Northwood and his niece, Clara, who served as his research assistant. Together they began cataloging everything: the structure of the house, the journals of Dr. Caldwell recovered from Boston's archives, and the strange symbols carved into the walls. By the second week, they made their first discovery. Behind the parlor, precisely where the old records mentioned a sealed chamber, they found a false wall. Layton had it carefully removed, revealing the hidden room untouched since 1871. The air inside was thick with dust and something else, something metallic, like blood that had long since dried. Clara described it as a feeling more than a smell, a weight that settled in her chest as soon as she entered. The walls were covered in carvings, the same looping. Sigils and runes that had puzzled Caldwell decades earlier. Some were symbols of known origin, fragments of Old Norse and early Latin, but others seemed impossible to categorize. Dr. Northwood traced one of the symbols with his gloved finger. "This one," he said quietly. "It looks almost like an alchemical sigil." Layton frowned. "Alchemy has no place here, Samuel. We are seeking the truth, not superstition." Clara's voice broke the tension. "And what if the truth is superstition?" The professor said nothing, but that night, when everyone else slept, he remained in the hidden room with a single lantern, sketching the carvings by hand. That was when he noticed it. Beneath a layer of soot, carved faintly into the floorboards, were the initials AR. Over the following days, the professor began to experience things he could not explain. The sound of footsteps in the hall when no one was there. Whispers, too soft to distinguish yet impossible to ignore. Once, while reviewing Timothy Caldwell's notes, he found that an entire page had been torn out during the night, replaced by a single line, written in fresh ink. "You are not the first to look for her." Layton confronted his assistants, believing it a cruel prank. But they denied it with genuine terror. Still, he refused to stop. Each evening, he grew more obsessed with deciphering the phrase carved into the hidden room. "She will return when the river calls her name." What did it mean? Who was she? Layton began searching local archives for any reference to Asha Ruin, the name recorded in Caldwell's journal. To his astonishment, he found a match, or at least part of one, a letter dated 1791, written by a traveling missionary named Jonas Markham. Described a young woman drowned in the Caldwell River after being accused of witchcraft. The letter named her Asha Ruin, a name that could easily have evolved into Asha Ruin through misinterpretation. Markham wrote, "They said she sang to the water, that the current obeyed her voice. When she was taken and bound to the stake, the river rose against them. After her death, they say, the river never ran clear again." Layton read those words in the flickering lamplight of the Caldwell study. His hands trembled. Could it be possible that Ilara's strange knowledge, her unearthly speech, her haunting, all traced back to this woman who died a century before her birth? The next night, Clara heard singing. She had woken suddenly, heart pounding, the moonlight spilling across her sheets. From somewhere deep in the manor came the faint melody of a lullaby, slow, haunting, impossibly clear. She followed the sound barefoot down the hall, her lantern trembling in her grip. The melody grew louder as she approached the hidden room. When she stepped inside, the lantern light flickered, and the singing stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then from the far wall, a whisper. "She remembers," Clara screamed. The lantern fell and shattered, plunging the room into darkness. By the time Layton and Northwood reached her, she was unconscious on the floor. The next morning she remembered nothing except the echo of that voice. Layton became consumed. His notes grew frantic. He stopped sleeping, His once careful handwriting turned wild, jagged. This is not possession. It is resonance. The child, Ilara, was the echo of Asha ruin, carried through generations. Her blood remembers the river. The river is not a symbol. It is a conduit. I must go there. On the night of August 17th, 1893, he did. The storm returned, almost identical to the one recorded in Timothy Caldwell's journal 23 years earlier. The wind screamed through the trees as Leighton took a lantern and made his way to the Caldwell River. Dr. Northwood tried to stop him. "Professor, please, wait for morning." But Leighton was beyond reason. "It has to be now," he said. "She calls when the river wakes." The rain fell in sheets, soaking the earth. The professor stood at the river's edge, the water black beneath the lightning. And then he heard it, a voice, soft, feminine, distant. "You sought her. You found her. Now she will find you." The lantern burst in his hand. In the flash of lightning, Dr. Northwood saw something rise from the water. Not a person, not entirely, but a form, pale, glistening, and luminous against the storm. Leighton took one step forward, then another, and then he was gone. When dawn came, only his hat was found, lying beside the riverbank, soaked and half buried in mud. Weeks later, the townsfolk began hearing rumors again. A young girl seen wandering the ridge at dusk, humming an old tune by the river. Sometimes travelers claimed to see a faint figure standing in the upper window of Caldwell Manor, a silhouette against the moonlight. Clara left the town soon after, taking with her the professor's remaining notes. She would spend the rest of her life trying to understand what had happened, publishing small papers under pseudonyms about transgenerational memory and the echoes of trauma. But one note from her private diary, discovered years later in a locked chest, offered the final clue. It read, "I have found the missing page from Dr. Caldwell's journal. It was never lost. The handwriting is not his, and it's hers. Ilara wrote it. She said, 'The water is my witness. When the river turns black again, I will remember everything.'" In the early 1900s, a flood struck Caldwell's Ridge. The river swelled higher than it had in 50 years, turning dark and thick with silt. Among the debris carried downstream was a wooden doll, half-rotted but unmistakable. Carved into its back were two sets of initials this time, AREC. The girl, they said, had been found. Or perhaps she had never truly left. And even now, when storms sweep through western Massachusetts, locals claim the same thing Timothy Caldwell once wrote in trembling ink. The river remembers. The winter thaw came late that year, and when it did, it came like a slow awakening. The ice along the Caldwell River broke apart in quiet sighs, and the world seemed to breathe again. But inside the once proud Caldwell Manor there was only silence, the kind that hung in the air like ash after a fire. The house was abandoned by spring. Margaret Caldwell had gone mad, they said. She spent her final days wandering the manor's upper halls, whispering her daughter's name to walls that never answered. As for Dr. Timothy Caldwell, no one truly knew. Some claimed he'd left town, heading toward Boston, carrying only a leather-bound journal. Others whispered he had followed the river one night and never returned. The story of Ilara Caldwell faded into rumor. By 1873, the townsfolk no longer spoke her name aloud, fearing it might invite something back. The manor became an empty relic, the last remnant of a tragedy no one wanted to understand. But the truth never truly disappears. It simply waits, buried beneath time, like bones beneath the frost. And in the summer of 1893, 23 years after Ilara vanished, the Caldwell estate was purchased by a man named Professor Abram Leighton, an Oxford scholar fascinated by anomalous human phenomena. He was tall, severe with a mind sharpened by obsession. His arrival in Caldwell's Ridge was met with polite curiosity, until he announced his purpose. "I intend," he declared to the townspeople, "to investigate what happened here, not as superstition, but as science." He believed Ilara's case to be an example of genetic memory, the theory that the mind could inherit memories from previous generations. It was radical for its time, dismissed by most scientists as fantasy. But Leighton was not deterred by ridicule. He arrived at the manor with two assistants, a young physician named Dr. Samuel Northwood and his niece Clara, who served as his research assistant. Together they began cataloging everything: the structure of the house, the journals of Dr. Caldwell recovered from Boston's archives, and the strange symbols carved into the walls. By the second week they made their first discovery. Behind the parlor, precisely where the old records mentioned a sealed chamber, they found a false wall. Leighton had it carefully removed, revealing the hidden room untouched since 1871. The air inside was thick with dust and something else, something metallic, like blood that had long since dried. Clara described it as a feeling more than a smell, a weight that settled in her chest as soon as she entered. The walls were covered in carvings, the same looping sigils and runes that had puzzled Caldwell decades earlier. Some were symbols of known origin, fragments of Old Norse and early Latin, but others seemed impossible to categorize. Dr. Northwood traced one of the symbols with his gloved finger. "This one," he said quietly. "It looks almost like an alchemical sigil." Leighton frowned. "Alchemy has no place here, Samuel. We are seeking the truth, not superstition." Clara's voice broke the tension. "And what if the truth is superstition?" The professor said nothing. But that night, when everyone else slept, he remained in the hidden room with a single lantern, sketching the carvings by hand. That was when he noticed it. Beneath a layer of soot, carved faintly into the floorboards, were the initials AR. Over the following days, the professor began to experience things he could not explain. The sound of footsteps in the hall when no one was there. Whispers too soft to distinguish yet impossible to ignore. Once, while reviewing Timothy Caldwell's notes, he found that an entire page had been torn out during the night, replaced by a single line, written in fresh ink. "You are not the first to look for her." Leighton confronted his assistants, believing it a cruel prank, but they denied it with genuine terror. Still, he refused to stop. Each evening he grew more obsessed with deciphering the phrase carved into the hidden room. "She will return when the river calls her name." What did it mean? Who was she? Leighton began searching local archives for any reference to Asha Ruin, the name recorded in Caldwell's journal. To his astonishment, he found a match, or at least part of one. A letter dated 1791, written by a traveling missionary named Jonas Markham, described a young woman drowned in the Caldwell River after being accused of witchcraft. The letter named her Asha Ruin, a name that could easily have evolved into Asha Ruin through misinterpretation. Markham wrote, "They said she sang to the water, that the current obeyed her voice. When she was taken and bound to the stake, the river rose against them. After her death, they say, the river never ran clear again." Leighton read those words in the flickering lamplight of the Caldwell study. His hands trembled. Could it be possible that Alara's strange knowledge, her unearthly speech, her haunting, all traced back to this woman who died a century before her birth? The next night, Clara heard singing. She had woken suddenly, heart pounding, the moonlight spilling across her sheets. From somewhere deep in the manor came the faint melody of a lullaby. Slow, haunting, impossibly clear. She followed the sound barefoot down the hall, her lantern trembling in her grip. The melody grew louder as she approached the hidden room. When she stepped inside, the lantern light flickered, and the singing stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then, from the far wall, a whisper. "She remembers," Clara screamed. The lantern fell and shattered, plunging the room into darkness. By the time Leighton and Northwood reached her, she was unconscious on the floor. The next morning, she remembered nothing, except the echo of that voice. Leighton became consumed. His notes grew frantic. He stopped sleeping. His once careful handwriting turned wild, jagged. This is not possession. It is resonance. The child, Ilara, was the echo of Asha Ruin, carried through generations. Her blood remembers the river. The river is not a symbol. It is a conduit. I must go there. On the night of August 17th, 1893, he did. The storm returned, almost identical to the one recorded in Timothy Caldwell's journal 23 years earlier. The wind screamed through the trees as Leighton took a lantern and made his way to the Caldwell River. Dr. Northwood tried to stop him. "Professor, please, wait for morning." But Leighton was beyond reason. "It has to be now," he said. "She calls when the river wakes." The rain fell in sheets, soaking the earth. The professor stood at the river's edge, the water black beneath the lightning. And then he heard it, a voice, soft, feminine, distant. You sought her. You found her. Now she will find you. The lantern burst in his hand. In the flash of lightning, Dr. Northwood saw something rise from the water. Not a person, not entirely, but a form, pale, glistening, and luminous against the storm. Leighton took one step forward, then another, and then he was gone. When dawn came, only his hat was found, lying beside the riverbank, soaked and half buried in mud. Weeks later, the townsfolk began hearing rumors again. A young girl seen wandering the ridge at dusk, humming an old tune by the river. Sometimes, travelers claimed to see a faint figure standing in the upper window of Caldwell Manor, a silhouette against the moonlight. Clara left the town soon after, taking with her the professor's remaining notes. She would spend the rest of her life trying to understand what had happened, publishing small papers under pseudonyms about transgenerational memory and the echoes of trauma. But one note from her private diary, discovered years later in a locked chest, offered the final clue. It read, "I have found the missing page from Dr. Caldwell's journal. It was never lost. The handwriting is not his, it's hers. Ilara wrote it. She said, 'The water is my witness. When the river turns black again, I will remember everything.'" In the early 1900s, a flood struck Caldwell's Ridge. The river swelled higher than it had in 50 years, turning dark and thick with silt. Among the debris carried downstream was a wooden doll, half-rotted but unmistakable. Carved into its back were two sets of initials this time. A-R-E. The girl, they said, had been found. Or perhaps she had never truly left. And even now, when storms sweep through western Massachusetts, locals claim the same thing Timothy Caldwell once wrote in trembling ink. The river remembers. By the winter of 1872, the Caldwell Manor had fallen into a silence that even the howling wind could not disturb. Snow gathered thick on the window ledges, and the world outside had turned white and motionless, like a photograph waiting to decay. Inside, the once grand corridors had grown dim, their chandeliers hanging like frozen skeletons of light. Dr. Timothy Caldwell now walked those halls with the weariness of a man who had stared too long into something he could neither explain nor forget. He had devoted months to the study of Ilara, the girl science couldn't explain. Each day he observed, each night he wrote in his journals, and yet every entry ended the same way. No rational conclusion. The anomaly persists. But beneath the disciplined handwriting, beneath the calm tone of a scientist, Timothy was breaking. He had begun to feel that the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was thinning, not just around Ilara, but within himself. Ilara's presence had changed. She was quieter now, less responsive, as though her soul existed half a second out of sync with time itself. Sometimes she would hum melodies no one had taught her, ancient haunting tunes that made the candles flicker, and the air seemed to pulse with invisible rhythm. At night, Timothy would awaken to the faint echo of that melody, floating through the halls from nowhere and everywhere at once. One evening, as frost clawed the window panes, Timothy decided to confront what reason had failed to tame. He entered the chamber where Ilara often sat in silence, her gaze fixed upon the old oval mirror that hung on the far wall. The mirror was a relic, its silvering cracked, its frame carved with unfamiliar symbols. It had been in the manor long before Ilara's arrival. Yet whenever she looked into it, her eyes seemed to recognize something. "Ilara," Timothy said softly, stepping into the flickering lamplight. "What do you see in that glass?" The girl didn't answer. Her lips moved faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if she were whispering to her reflection. Then without turning, she spoke. "She remembers you, Doctor." Timothy froze. "Who remembers me?" "The one you've forgotten." A chill rippled down his spine. He took a step closer. The air thickened, heavy with static, and for a moment, he swore the reflection in the mirror moved differently from their real bodies, as though the glass world ran on its own rhythm. Timothy forced himself to meet his reflection's eyes. His own face stared back, pale and drawn, But behind his image stood a second figure, faint, translucent, the shape of a woman in a white dress, her head bowed. He blinked, and the figure vanished. "Alara," he whispered. "Who is she?" Alara turned to him then, her eyes deep and far older than her years. "She comes when the truth is near." That night, Timothy pored over the archives of the manor, searching through centuries of family records. Candlelight danced across brittle pages as he traced the lineage of his bloodline. And then, he found her. Margaret Caldwell, his great-grandmother. A brilliant mind, accused of witchcraft in 1814 after the mysterious deaths of 3 townsfolk. She was said to have vanished during a winter storm, her body never found. Local legend whispered that she had bound herself to knowledge no mortal should possess. Timothy sat back, his breath trembling. Margaret's last known residence had been the very chamber where Alara now slept. Could it be possible that Alara's presence, her strange abilities, her impossible aura, was the echo of that forbidden inheritance? Or something far worse, something that had survived through the bloodline itself? As dawn approached, Timothy's mind spiraled between reason and dread. He resolved to perform a test, one that would either prove Alara's nature or end his sanity. The next night, he brought Alara before the mirror again. "Alara," he said, "if there's someone beyond this reflection, show me." The girl looked into the glass, her breath fogging the surface. Then she placed her hand upon it. The moment her skin touched the mirror, the air rippled. Candle flames bent sideways, and the room filled with a low, resonant hum, a sound too deep for the human ear, yet felt in the bones. Timothy stepped closer, eyes wide. Within the reflection, the room twisted, its walls warped, and from the depths of the mirror emerged faint silhouettes, as though a crowd watched from the other side. Alara's voice trembled. "They want to be seen." "Who are they?" Timothy demanded. Her gaze met his through the reflection. "The forgotten." Then, the mirror cracked. A surge of icy air burst from it, knocking Timothy backward. He hit the floor, gasping as shards of glass rained down like frozen rain. When he looked up, Alara was gone. Only her faint reflection remained, still standing inside the broken mirror, her eyes pleading from beyond the fractured surface. Timothy crawled forward, calling her name again and again, but his voice vanished into the cold silence. The fire had died. The room was dim except for the ghostly shimmer that lingered upon the cracked glass. And in that light, he saw something carved into the frame, something that hadn't been there before. 3 words, etched as if burned by invisible hands. She chose knowledge. The thaw of spring came late to Caldwell Hollow in 1873. The snow retreated slowly, like a wounded animal, leaving the land wet and bruised beneath it. The river swelled, devouring the lower woods, and the lake behind the manor grew dark and restless. Timothy Caldwell hadn't seen the sun in weeks. Curtains were drawn. Lamps stayed lit through the night. In the upper chamber where the mirror had cracked, time had begun to dissolve. He had stopped recording his observations in scientific language. His journal now read like the diary of a man suspended between 2 worlds. "The boundaries are gone," he had written on one trembling night. "Whatever took Alara through the glass has not left this house. I hear her breathing in the walls. Sleep no longer came easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes, a vast dark expanse of water, a faint lantern glowing beneath its surface, and a girl's silhouette drifting slowly down into the depths. Sometimes he woke with damp hands, as if he'd been clawing at the surface of a lake that wasn't there. One evening, while the manor moaned beneath the weight of a storm, Timothy heard something new, a knock, soft, deliberate, 3 taps on the library door. He opened it to find no one there, only a trail of wet footprints leading toward the staircase. He followed them, lamp in hand, the flame trembling as if afraid to see. The footprints descended, not up. They led toward the cellars beneath the manor, rooms sealed for decades, where his ancestors once stored wine, and where, according to old servants' tales, Margaret Caldwell had conducted her private experiments. The door at the bottom of the stairs resisted him. Rusted iron and swollen wood made it heavy as stone. But when he pressed his hand against it, it opened by itself, swinging inward with a sigh of stale air. Inside lay a room no larger than a chapel's apse, circular, with walls lined by books eaten by mildew. In the center was a stone basin filled with black water. Candles surrounded it, burned down to stubs, as if they had been lit and relit for years. Timothy's lamp reflected faintly on the water's surface. For a moment he saw only himself, hollow-eyed, gaunt, an echo of the man who had once come to study a miracle. But then the reflection changed. Another face appeared beside his. Ilara. Her eyes looked brighter, almost luminous, and her lips moved silently beneath the water. He could not hear her, but her expression was pleading, desperate, as though she were trapped beneath a sheet of ice. "Ilara," he shouted. "Where are you?" The water rippled, distorting her face into fragments. Then slowly, letters began to form on the surface, drawn by invisible fingers, beneath the lake. Timothy staggered back. Beneath the lake, the one behind the manor, where the reeds grew high and the fog never lifted. He remembered how the locals avoided it, claiming the waters there never froze in winter, even when the river turned solid. He didn't wait for dawn. He lit a lantern, wrapped himself in his coat, and walked into the night. The wind screamed through the trees, bending branches like brittle bones. When he reached the shore, the lake was a sheet of black glass, the moon hiding behind a curtain of cloud. He stepped closer, the mud sucking at his boots. "Ilara," he called. "If you can hear me, show me." The wind fell silent. The reeds stood still. Then faintly the surface began to glow, a pale light spreading outward from the center, as though a lantern had been lit deep below. Timothy waded in, the cold biting into his legs. The glow grew brighter, pulsing with each step. When he reached waist-deep water, he saw something move beneath the surface, a shape, human, swaying gently. His breath hitched. "Ilara!" He reached down, and the moment his hand touched the water, a shock went through him. The lake erupted into color, flashes of memory, fragments of light, faces spinning through darkness. He saw the manor's great hall burning, his ancestors standing in a circle around the same mirror, chanting words that twisted the air. He saw Margaret Caldwell, her eyes alight with fury and fear, shouting over the storm, "The vessel must live!" Then, the world snapped back. Timothy found himself standing on the lake's frozen center, though moments before it had been water. Beneath the ice, he saw Ilara's face again, calm now, her eyes closed. But beside her floated another, his own. The lantern light flickered beneath them both, casting their faces in alternating shadows. He fell to his knees, pounding the ice. "No, no!" His voice echoed across the hollow. "I can save you." The ice cracked, a deep thunderous groan, and the lantern below flickered brighter. A voice, neither fully hers nor fully human, whispered from the depths, "You were never meant to save me. You were meant to remember." The ice shattered. Timothy plunged into darkness, the cold closing over him like a fist. He felt the weight of water pressing against his chest, dragging him down. But through the blur, he saw her, Ilara, holding the lantern, her hair swirling like ink in the current. He reached for her, but she didn't move. Instead, she lifted the lantern toward him. The flame inside it flared, flooding the water with golden light. Images burst around him, centuries collapsing into one. His great-grandmother's experiments, Ilara's childhood, the moment the mirror first fractured. He saw that they were not separate, that Ilara was not a stranger, but the latest vessel of a lineage bound to forbidden knowledge. Each generation carried the echo forward until one of them could face it, and now it was his turn. The light grew too bright to bear. Timothy screamed, but no sound came out. Then, silence. When the townsfolk came days later, they found the lake calm and still. The doctor was gone. His house stood open, the fires long dead. Only one thing was found, a small brass lantern resting on the shore, still burning beneath the morning fog. No one could explain how it stayed lit, and when someone finally dared to look into the water, they swore they saw, just for an instant, two figures walking hand in hand beneath the surface, a man and a girl, moving toward a door of light. By the time spring's first wildflowers pushed through the soil, the Caldwell Manor had become little more than a mausoleum. Ivy crept through its shattered windows, dust blanketed its marble floors, and the air inside was heavy, not just with age, but with memory. The townspeople no longer spoke of the place except in whispers. Children dared one another to run past the front gates at midnight, and travelers claimed to see a faint light flickering through the upper windows, a golden glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Yet, within those empty walls, something had stirred again. In late April of 1873, a team of surveyors from the county arrived to inspect the property. The estate had fallen into disuse since Dr. Timothy Caldwell's disappearance, and ownership had defaulted to the parish. The men were practical folk, unbothered by old legends, unmoved by ghost stories. But when they stepped through the doors of the manor, practicality faltered. The air was colder than the spring day outside. Every sound echoed twice, once in the ear and once deeper, like a whisper behind thought. They found the doctor's study just as he had left it. Notes scattered across the desk, journals open to pages filled with strange diagrams, circles, lines and symbols that resembled constellations. One of the men, a veteran named Alan Fisk, turned a page and frowned. "What kind of doctor draws this?" he muttered. Another replied, "Maybe the kind who lost his mind." But Fisk didn't answer. His eyes had caught on something else, a line written in trembling ink at the bottom of the page. "When the lantern burns again, the mirror will open." That night, the men decided to camp in the manor's great hall, sheltering from the storm that rolled in from the hills. Rain battered the windows and the house groaned as though the wind itself carried a voice. The men laughed it off at first, telling stories and drinking. But as the night deepened, the laughter died. Somewhere above them, a faint hum began, low and rhythmic, like someone whispering through the walls. The youngest of them, a boy barely 20, turned pale. "You hear that?" he said. Fisk raised his lantern. "Rats," he said. "Just rats in the beams." But the hum grew louder, filling the hall, resonating in the bones. It wasn't coming from above. It was beneath them. The floorboards trembled. The light from Fisk's lantern flickered and then, for a heartbeat, turned blue. What the hell? The glow swelled, rising from the floor like mist, gathering in the center of the hall. Shapes began to take form, faint outlines of faces, hundreds of them, rippling as though seen through water. The men froze. One dropped his lantern, shattering the glass. The blue light devoured the room, and then, through the radiance, a voice spoke. Not loud, just clear. "Remember what was begun." The air cracked like thunder. The blue light vanished. The men stumbled backward, gasping, and when they looked again, the floor had split open. Beneath the broken boards lay a staircase of stone descending into darkness. Fisk stared at it, his breath trembling. "Beneath the lake," he whispered, remembering the words they'd read in the journals. They descended slowly, lanterns trembling in their hands. The air grew colder, wetter, until they reached a chamber lined with stone and carved with symbols identical to those in Timothy's notes. At its center was a basin of still, dark water, the same that had appeared in the doctor's cellar, but this time, something glowed faintly beneath its surface. The brass lantern. It burned just as the doctor's notes had described, its light steady and golden. Untouched by decay, one of the men knelt beside it, reaching toward the water. Fisk grabbed his wrist. "Don't," he warned. "You saw what that light did upstairs." But curiosity has a way of silencing caution. The man touched the surface. The water rippled, and in that ripple appeared faces. Ilara, Timothy, Margaret Caldwell, and others, dozens more, each with eyes that seemed both human and not, gazing upward from the depths. Fisk dropped his lantern and fell back. "God help us." The water rose, forming a shape, a column of liquid that took on faint human features. Ilara's face surfaced within it, her expression serene, her voice a whisper in their minds. It was never meant to end with him. Fisk stumbled toward the stairs, shouting for the others to run. But the air around them shifted, thickening into a current. The brass lantern flared brighter, its light climbing the walls, tracing the same symbols carved centuries before. The men heard a sound then, a heartbeat, slow and immense, echoing from within the stone, and with every beat, the light pulsed. Ilara's voice wove through it. "Knowledge cannot die. It remembers itself. It returns." When dawn came, the storm had passed. Locals found the manor silent once more. The surveyor's horses stood tethered outside, restless, their reins slick with dew, but the men themselves were gone. Only one thing remained on the front steps, the brass lantern, still burning, its flame impossibly steady despite the rain. Inside the manor, the air was still, but if one stood quietly in the grand hall, they could hear, faintly, beneath the hum of the morning wind, the sound of pages turning. Timothy Caldwell's journals lay open on the desk, and though no one touched them, the ink began to move. New words formed, written by an unseen hand. The final experiment has begun. Weeks later, travelers passing by Caldwell Lake swore they saw ripples on its surface, though no wind stirred. Some claimed to see a lantern's glow drifting beneath the water. Others said they heard a voice calling softly, asking not to be saved but to be remembered. And as summer came, the manor's windows began to glow again at night, one by one, like stars awakening after centuries of silence. Some said it was the doctor, returned to finish what he started. Others said it was the girl, still searching for an ending science could not write. But the truth was older, something that breathed through every brick of that cursed house, every reflection, every dream. And in that truth, one thing had become certain. The Caldwell line was not broken. It had only changed shape. By the autumn of 1873, the Caldwell Manor was no longer merely abandoned. It was alive. The vines that once strangled its outer walls had grown in unnatural spirals, curling toward the windows as if listening for something inside. The air itself trembled faintly, even on still days, as though the house were exhaling. Those who lived near the hollow swore that the house dreamed. They said that when the moon was full, a soft humming could be heard from miles away, a sound like hundreds of voices murmuring beneath the floorboards. A few travelers had dared to step onto the grounds, only to return dazed, unable to speak, their eyes reflecting faint gold light for days after. But it was not until September that someone entered the manor and stayed long enough to see what it had become. Her name was Clara Winslow, a journalist from London, curious, skeptical, and known for her investigations into the strange and unexplainable. She had read of the manor's history, the girl, the vanished doctor, the broken mirror, the glowing lantern. To her, these were tales of human folly, stories of fear mistaken for mysticism. She came not to believe, but to document. Clara arrived on a fog-laden morning. The air around the manor felt heavy, as if carrying a secret too old to speak. The iron gates creaked open at her touch, and the wind that greeted her smelled faintly of wet stone and candle wax. Inside, she found everything preserved, almost unnaturally so. The furniture bore no dust. The candles, though unlit, seemed freshly molded. On the mantel above the cold fireplace sat the brass lantern, its glass clear, the wick unburned. She wrote in her notebook, "The manor breathes." Each creak feels deliberate, as if the house is watching, waiting. As she explored, her footsteps echoed endlessly. The portraits on the walls seemed to follow her gaze. And in one hallway, the longest of all, she found a door that had been nailed shut from the outside. The wood was splintered and warped, but carved faintly into its surface were 3 initials. T.C. Timothy Caldwell, she whispered. She pried the nails free one by one. When the door finally opened, a rush of air escaped. Not stale, but strangely warm, almost like a sigh of relief. Inside, the room was empty except for a mirror, standing upright against the far wall. It was cracked, just as the stories described, its silver backing warped into shapes that shifted like smoke. Clara stepped closer, lifting her lantern. Her reflection looked back, pale, trembling slightly from the uneven glass. But then her reflection smiled. She froze. Her real lips hadn't moved. "Is this some trick?" she whispered, stepping nearer. "Who's there?" The reflection tilted its head. And then it spoke, though no sound reached her ears. Instead, the words bloomed inside her mind like an echo. "You came to write the story, but the story has been waiting for you." The lantern in her hand flickered once, and the flame turned blue. Clara stumbled backward, her heartbeat hammering in her throat. The mirror rippled as if made of liquid, and faint images began to appear within it. The manor, but alive, filled with people in old clothing, moving soundlessly through its halls. She saw Timothy Caldwell among them, writing feverishly by candlelight. And behind him, the girl, Ilara, her eyes hollow, her expression both human and inhuman. Clara whispered, "What is this?" The girl turned in the reflection, as though hearing her. "It's what remains," Ilara said softly. He opened the door. "You will write it closed." Then, the room shifted. The walls pulsed, the air grew thick with mist, and Clara felt something tugging at her wrist. She looked down. Her hand was sinking into the mirror. The surface of it had become water, cold and unyielding. She tried to pull away, but the reflection's hand held hers tightly. The room blurred into blue light. When she woke, she was standing in a version of the manor that was both familiar and impossibly new. The candles burned gold, the air was warm, and faint music drifted through the corridors, a music that felt alive. Composed by memory itself, Timothy Caldwell stood before her, as solid and real as any living man. "You're not real," she said. "Breathless. Neither are you," he replied gently. "Not anymore." She stepped back, shaking her head. "Where am I?" "You're inside the echo," Timothy said. "The house remembers. It builds from memory, from us, from anyone who touches it." Ilara opened the mirror, but I completed it. I made the bridge between thought and form. He moved closer. His eyes were hollow but kind. "You don't understand yet, but you will. Every mind that enters this house adds another layer to it. Every story told feeds it. It's not cursed, Miss Winslow. It's evolving," she whispered. "Evolving into what?" He smiled faintly. "Into understanding." Suddenly the air shifted again and the candles flickered violently. The walls trembled. Ilara appeared at the far end of the corridor, her figure glowing faintly. But her face was different now, older, tired. "She's coming apart," Timothy whispered. "Ilara." Clara called. The girl turned toward her, tears glinting in her eyes. "It's too full," she said, her voice trembling. "Too many memories, too many souls. It can't hold them all." The house began to groan, a deep, resonant sound that rolled through the floors like thunder. Cracks split across the walls, light spilling through them like veins of molten gold. Timothy grabbed Clara's hand. "You have to leave. You're still alive out there. The house hasn't finished taking you. But what about you?" He smiled sadly. "We're already part of it." The floor began to collapse, fragments falling into an endless abyss of blue light. The sound of whispers filled the air, hundreds of voices, each one repeating the same word. "Remember." Clara ran toward the fading doorway. She turned once, looking back. Ilara stood in the midst of the chaos, holding the brass lantern, its light now pure white. Timothy stood beside her. They both raised their hands as if in farewell. Then the world inverted, a surge of light, a final heartbeat, and everything vanished. When Clara opened her eyes again, she was lying outside on the cold grass near the lake. The manor stood silent behind her, its windows dark, its reflection trembling in the water. The morning was quiet. Birds sang. For a moment she thought it had all been a dream, but in her hand was the brass lantern. It glowed faintly, not with fire but with memory. She looked into its light and saw, for an instant, her own reflection, and behind it, the faces of those who came before, Timothy, Ilara, Margaret. And then her own name appeared, etched faintly across the glass. "Clara Winslow," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The story never ends, does it?" The lantern flickered once, almost like a nod. The morning after the séance at Caldwell Manor carried an eerie calm, as though the entire house had taken a long, weary breath. The night had left behind the faint smell of candle wax, burnt incense and something else, something metallic, almost like the residue of blood on old iron. The doctor's equipment lay untouched in the study, and the mirror that had cracked during the ritual still bore the same lightning-shaped fracture, like the scar of a wound that refused to heal. Timothy Caldwell had not slept. He sat in the library, eyes hollow, still replaying the voice that had come from his daughter's throat, a voice that had called his full name with a tone both loving and accusing. He had heard the dead before, but never like that. He kept whispering to himself, "It wasn't her." It couldn't have been her. But his conviction was dissolving by the hour. Dr. Everard came quietly down the stairs, his expression grave, holding a notebook clutched tight against his chest. "I've reviewed my notes," he said softly. "Whatever manifested last night, it wasn't a hallucination. The temperature fluctuations, The electromagnetic shifts, the synchronized clocks, they all confirm something real occurred. Timothy turned sharply toward him. "Then tell me, Doctor, what is she?" Everard hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever she is, she's not what we would call alive. Nor is she entirely gone." By noon, the house had fallen into an unnatural silence. Alara had not come down from her room. When the maids had tried to enter, the door would not open, though it had no lock. Inside, faint humming could be heard. A lullaby, one that Lady Caldwell used to sing before her death. Timothy stood outside that door, trembling. "Alara, it's father." No reply. Only the lullaby continuing, faint and ghost-like. He turned to Everard. "Break it down." The doctor hesitated. "If we disturb her in this state, we could—" "I don't care," Timothy barked. "She's my daughter." The men pushed hard. The door finally gave way with a heavy crack, and inside, the room was not as they remembered it. Every object was perfectly aligned, the dolls, the paintings, even the folds of the bedsheets. In the middle of the floor, Alara sat cross-legged, her eyes rolled back, whispering in a tongue neither man recognized. Everard stepped forward, recording everything in his notebook. "It's structured," he muttered. "Repeating syllables, rhythmic pattern, almost like an ancient chant." Timothy knelt in front of her. "Alara, wake up!" At the sound of his voice, she stopped. Her head turned slowly toward him, and when she spoke, it was with two voices layered together, one high and childlike, the other deep, hollow, and ancient. "You called upon what you do not understand." That evening, Everard attempted to make sense of the recordings. He played back the sounds through his phonograph, amplifying the chant. Hidden within the words was something he had not noticed before. The chant contained precise mathematical patterns. Every third syllable fell on a Fibonacci sequence. Every rise and fall of tone matched lunar cycles. "This isn't madness," he whispered. "It's design, it's knowledge." He turned to Timothy. "Your daughter is channeling something that transcends our comprehension, something that existed before language, before reason." Timothy's hands shook. "You mean she's possessed?" Everard's eyes narrowed. "Possessed? No. Possession implies control. This is symbiosis." At that moment, a piercing scream echoed through the manor. Both men ran upstairs to Alara's room, only to find it empty. The window was wide open, curtains thrashing violently in the stormy wind. Below in the courtyard, faint footprints glowed in the mud, small, barefoot impressions radiating faint blue light, leading into the forest. Without hesitation, Timothy grabbed a lantern and followed. The woods were darker than ever, thick fog crawling like a living thing. The wind carried whispers, fragmented words in Alara's voice. "Father, come home, follow." Timothy's heart pounded. Everard trailed close behind, struggling to keep up. "We must be careful," he shouted. "If she's channeling that force, proximity could—" But before he could finish, the fog parted, revealing an old stone well in the clearing, one that neither of them remembered seeing before. Moss-covered, ancient, older than the manor itself. And sitting by its edge was Alara, humming softly. Timothy stepped closer, voice breaking. "Alara, please, let's go home." She tilted her head. "Home?" she whispered. "But I'm home." And then with both hands she touched the edge of the well. The air around them began to shimmer. The temperature dropped sharply. From the well's depths came a faint, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat buried deep underground. Everard stumbled back, shouting over the noise. "She's activating something. It's responding to her frequency." The pulse grew louder, thump, 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 until the earth itself seemed to breathe. The lantern flickered out. For a split second, everything went black. When Timothy's vision cleared, Alara was standing, eyes wide open, now glowing the same blue as the footprints. Her voice came again, in that terrible harmony of two souls. "She is not yours to keep, Timothy Caldwell. She belongs to what made her." They ran. Through the forest, through the fog, through the whispers that clawed at their ears. When they finally reached the manor, Timothy collapsed in the hall, gasping for breath. Everard locked the doors, shaking uncontrollably. "Whatever that thing is," he said hoarsely, "it's tied to the land itself. Your family's history, the manor, the well, the graves on the hill, all of it is connected. You've inherited something far beyond understanding." Timothy looked up slowly, eyes glazed. Then I will destroy it, every trace of it, if that's what it takes to bring her back. Everard's face turned pale. You can't destroy what's older than the earth. You can only survive it. But Timothy didn't listen. That night he gathered the servants, ordered them to burn the woods surrounding the well. Flames erupted, licking the sky, devouring the trees and the ancient stones beneath. And from deep within the inferno, a scream tore through the night, not human, not earthly. It shook the foundations of the manor, shattered glass, and silenced birds for miles. The next morning there was no sign of Alara, no footprints, no sound, no movement, only ashes and the faint smell of burnt soil that lingered for weeks. Timothy locked himself in his study for days, refusing to speak. When Everard finally forced his way in, he found the man sitting motionless at his desk, staring at a drawing on the wall, a child's sketch of the family, done in Alara's hand, but someone, or something, had added to it. Behind the family figures stood a faint outline, drawn in charcoal, tall and shapeless, with eyes like two empty stars. Days passed. The staff began to leave one by one, unable to bear the tension. The manor grew colder, emptier, quieter. Everard prepared to leave too, until one final event stopped him. It was midnight when he heard it, the piano, playing by itself in the music room. The same melody from the séance. He crept toward the door, heart pounding. Inside, the keys moved on their own, pressing down gently, almost lovingly. And there, seated at the piano, was Timothy Caldwell, but his eyes were not his own. Alara, he whispered without looking up. She's here now. She forgave me. Everard stepped closer, trembling. Timothy, listen to me. That's not her. That's the same force that spoke through her. But Timothy only smiled, a serene, almost divine expression. Science could not explain her, he said softly, because she wasn't meant to be explained. The piano struck one final note, sharp as a blade, and then silence. When Everard blinked, the room was empty. Timothy Caldwell was gone. Only the faint echo of that final note lingered, vibrating through the air long after the sound should have died. Weeks turned to months. The manor stood abandoned, its windows sealed by dust and ivy, its halls swallowed by silence. The townsfolk of Wickbridge avoided even glancing at the Caldwell estate. They said the air around it shimmered faintly at night, that if one stood too close, the world itself seemed to breathe differently. Dr. Everard was the only one who returned. He came one cold December morning, wrapped in his worn coat, a notebook clutched to his chest. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, the same eyes of a man who had seen beyond the limits of reason. He had spent months studying every record of the Caldwell family, every journal, every parish archive that had survived the manor fire, and he had found something. In a forgotten record of the town's founding, he discovered a name, Elira, a girl who, in 1643, was documented as touched by unearthly knowledge. Witnesses had described her as a vessel through which unseen intelligences spoke. Her village had burned her alive after her body began emitting light during a sermon. The ashes were buried beneath what would one day become the Caldwell property. Elira Caldwell, the girl who could recite equations older than arithmetic, who spoke languages no scholar could trace, had been born 3 centuries to the day after that execution. It wasn't reincarnation. It was repetition. Everard stepped into the manor's ruined halls. The air was still. His footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. On the walls, faded portraits of the Caldwell line stared down at him, proud faces now cracked with age and neglect. The fireplace was cold, filled with ash that had long turned to gray dust. He walked toward the piano. Its cover was open, and a thin layer of soot rested on the keys. When his hand brushed across them, one key, the middle C, moved slightly on its own. Everard froze. "Timothy?" he whispered. For a moment, nothing. Then a faint, almost inaudible voice. "You shouldn't have come back." Everard stumbled backward, lantern trembling in his hand. "Alara?" The piano responded, 3 notes, slow and deliberate. C, A, E. The same triad from the séance. The room darkened. The air grew thick and heavy. Everard's lantern flickered violently, shadows stretching long across the walls, and in that distortion of light, a figure began to form, faint, translucent, shimmering with blue light. It was her, Ilara. But she was not a child anymore. Her form shimmered, fractured between age and agelessness, her eyes now vast pools of pale light, her skin faintly radiant. Everard spoke, barely above a whisper. "Ilara, what are you?" She blinked slowly, and when she answered, it was in that same dual voice, layered, resonant, eternal. "I am what remains when the world forgets its own beginnings." The doctor's mind raced. Your energy, consciousness." She tilted her head. "I am memory of what the earth once knew before it began to think." Everard trembled. "Why the Caldwells? Why Timothy? Why you?" The air quivered around her. The piano began to hum, vibrating softly. "Because he called," she said, "and because I never stopped answering." The doctor fell to his knees. "Then where is he now?" She looked toward the ceiling, or perhaps beyond it. "With me, where science cannot reach and faith cannot follow." Outside, a storm began to rise. The windows rattled, the ancient timbers groaned. Everard's lantern went out, plunging the room into darkness except for her glow. "Ilara, listen to me," he said desperately. "You must let go. Whatever you are, whatever this force is, it's consuming everything it touches." Her voice softened. "It cannot consume what it created. The world you know, Doctor, is only a shadow of a design much older." She stepped closer, though her feet made no sound. "You called it science," she whispered. "But science is only the language your kind invented to describe the things they could not feel." Everard shook his head. No, this is madness. This defies every principle." "It defines them," she interrupted. "Every principle you follow is a fragment of a truth your kind shattered long ago. We were once one, until you forgot." And then, for a heartbeat, her expression changed. Sorrow flickered through the glow. "Tell them when they ask that I was never a miracle. I was a memory." The manor trembled. The wind screamed through the cracks in the glass. Everard tried to stand, but his body felt weightless, as though the air itself was pulling him upward. Papers from his notebook spiraled into the air, circling the glowing figure like feathers. He cried out, "Ilara! Stop this!" She raised her hands. The blue light intensified, flooding every corner of the room. For a brief instant he saw everything. The well in the woods, the ashes beneath it, the faces of generations past. He saw Timothy standing beside her, eyes calm, holding her hand. And then, silence. When the storm cleared, Wickbridge awoke to find the manor completely still. No damage, no fire, no sound, just quiet, deep, endless quiet. Days later, a search party entered. The house was empty. Every object stood exactly where it had been left. Save for one difference. The piano had been moved to the center of the hall, and on its keys, someone had carved 3 letters, ECE. Dr. Everard was never seen again. The townsfolk spoke of him in hushed tones. Some said he'd gone mad, taken by the same spirit that haunted the Caldwells. Others believed he'd finally uncovered the truth and couldn't live with it. The manor was sealed by the church, declared unholy ground. But those who lived nearby swore that on stormy nights, when lightning touched the sky, they could hear faint music coming from the ruins, a slow, haunting melody played by invisible hands. And sometimes, if one listened closely, a child's laughter echoed faintly in the wind. Years passed. The story of the girl science couldn't explain became legend, a ghost tale for scholars and skeptics alike. Some said it was proof of life beyond death. Others believed it was a warning that there are questions the human mind was never meant to ask. But the truth, the real truth, lay somewhere beyond both science and faith. For in the ashes beneath the Caldwell estate, in the soil where no plant ever grew again, a faint blue glow could sometimes still be seen, like the last heartbeat of something ancient. Watching, waiting, remembering. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.